My name is Lily Whitaker, and if you asked anyone around me, they'd say I've had a perfectly ordinary life. A stable career in art curation, a quiet home, and a second marriage that lasted a good decade until my husband's passing. I thought I knew the people closest to me. I thought I knew myself. That was until I ended up stranded outside Twin Falls with Nate, my late husband's son from his first marriage. We hadn't spent much time together over the years. Nate was distant, and I supposed I respected that boundary. Still, when he asked for help sorting out some property details after his father's passing, I agreed without too much thought. It was only a couple of hours' drive, nothing I hadn't done before. Or so I thought. The trouble began somewhere along Route 84. A strange grinding noise under the hood, the car lurching, and then nothing. No signal, no friendly roadside cafe in sight. Just the two of us and the quiet, open road. We found a small inn down a side road. The kind of place that's seen better days, yet somehow still clings to business. I assumed it would be one night, a small inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. But as hours turned into days, the waiting began to wear on us both, and the hotel's odd silence crept under my skin. That's when Edgar entered the picture. An older man with a persistent, almost invasive way of striking up conversations. He hinted at knowing Nate. Not only that, he implied things about my stepson I could barely bring myself to believe. That one of the people closest to me might be more of a stranger than I ever thought possible. Looking back, I wonder if we were doomed the moment we pulled into that parking lot. In that old, silent hotel, I began questioning everything. My choices, my past, and most of all, the young man I once thought was my son. I'd never thought that silence could feel this heavy. The open road had always brought me peace, yet sitting next to Nate in that quiet car felt odd. He hadn't spoken much, save for a few polite pleasantries. I'd glance at him occasionally, trying to gauge his mood. He looked distracted, his gaze fixed out the window, lost in thoughts I wasn't privy to. Nate had always been hard to read. When I married his father, Hal, he was already in his early 20s, a brooding young man who'd barely come around for family dinners. He'd visit Hal on occasion, but I'd often feel like an intruder in their conversations. My relationship with Hal was filled with joy and ease, but I could never say the same for my relationship with his son. Nate was elusive, distant, as if he existed in a different realm altogether. Maybe that was why I agreed to help him with this property situation. After Hal's passing, I figured it might be a way to connect with him, however belatedly. Besides, Hal would have wanted that. "Look after Nate," he'd said on one of his last lucid days, his voice faint but sincere. I'd nodded, as if that task was simple. Looking after someone who seemed determined to keep everyone at arm's length felt like trying to catch fog. So there we were, on the open road, Salt Lake City gradually disappearing in the rearview mirror. We drove for hours in near silence, save for the faint hum of the radio that Nate occasionally adjusted. I didn't mind. Silence had never bothered me. But then the car began to make a strange, shuddering noise. It started faint, barely noticeable, but soon it grew into a low, grinding sound. Nate looked over at me, his eyebrows knitted in concern. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Of course I heard it," I replied, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Feels like the engine's struggling." I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it was something minor. But when Nate popped open the hood, his expression didn't fill me with much confidence. The engine was making an awful noise, and the smell, a hot, acrid scent that made me think we were far past a quick fix. "Looks like we'll need a tow," he muttered, looking down at his phone. He held it up, shaking his head. "No service out here." I glanced down the long stretch of highway ahead of us. Nothing but empty road and distant mountains. "Let's try walking," I suggested, feigning more optimism than I felt. After half an hour on foot, we spotted a small sign pointing down a dirt road. "Elmwood Inn, 3 miles. We exchanged a glance. It was better than nothing. The Elmwood Inn was one of those places that time seemed to forget. An old, faded sign hung above a single-story building that looked as if it might have been charming in another era. Now it seemed more worn, the paint peeling, the windows clouded with dust and age. We stepped inside, and a bell chimed above us. The lobby was empty, save for a man at the counter who looked up as we entered. He had a face that seemed vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. He offered us a tight smile. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice gravelly, as though he hadn't spoken in days. "Yes, please," I replied. "Our car broke down nearby." The man nodded, reaching for a set of keys behind the counter. "Not many guests these days. You'll have your choice of rooms." As he handed us the keys, his gaze lingered on Nate a little longer than felt comfortable. "Nice to see you again," he muttered. I looked at Nate, puzzled, but he merely shrugged, avoiding my gaze. We took the keys and made our way to the room, the silence between us stretching thin. Inside, the room was simple: a bed, a dresser, and a small television that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. I tried to get comfortable, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over me since we arrived. The room felt too still, almost as if it were waiting for something to happen. That night, as I lay awake, I could hear faint voices through the thin walls, whispers that seemed to float through the darkness. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just the wind or the usual creaks of an old building. But then I heard Nate's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone just outside the room. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, tiptoeing to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening as Nate's voice mingled with another, deeper one. Their words were muffled, but I caught snippets. "Can't keep this up. She doesn't know." The second voice replied something equally vague, and then they both fell silent. I waited, my heart pounding, until I heard Nate's footsteps approaching. I hurried back to bed, feigning sleep as he slipped into the room. He paused, and I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and contemplative, before he finally lay down on his side of the bed. The next morning, Nate was quiet again, his usual aloofness tinged with a hint of tension. I thought about asking him about the conversation, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the feeling that I wouldn't like the answer, or maybe it was the unsettling realization that in all our years of knowing each other, I had never truly known him. Over breakfast in the lobby, the same man from last night approached us. He introduced himself as Edgar and took a seat across from us, uninvited. "You folks planning on staying long?" he asked, eyeing Nate with a knowing smirk. "We're just waiting for the car to be repaired," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but dismissive. Edgar chuckled, glancing at Nate. "Funny how fate works, isn't it? Brings people back together in the strangest of places." I felt a chill creep over me. "Do you two know each other?" I asked, unable to hide my curiosity any longer. Nate's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "We've met," he said shortly, his tone leaving no room for further questions. Edgar shrugged, unfazed by Nate's cold response. "It's a small world," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Or maybe it's just the way things are meant to be." I didn't know what to make of that. Edgar left soon after, leaving a strange silence in his wake. I glanced at Nate, hoping he'd offer some sort of explanation, but he remained tight-lipped, his eyes fixed on his coffee, as if it held all the answers he needed. That evening, as we prepared to settle in for another night at the inn, I decided to take a walk. The inn's surroundings were quiet, and the night air was crisp, the stars glinting coldly in the dark sky. I felt a sense of unease I couldn't shake, a gnawing feeling that something was very wrong, even if I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. As I walked, I found myself back near the lobby, where Edgar was leaning against the front desk, his eyes on me the moment I walked in. "You should be careful, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice low and ominous. "Not everyone is who they seem." I blinked, taken aback. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, giving me a smile that was anything but reassuring. Just a friendly warning. I returned to our room, my mind racing. I wanted to confront Nate, to demand answers. But something stopped me. A gut feeling that whatever was going on, I wasn't ready to know. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I could feel the weight of unspoken words filling the room. Nate was keeping secrets. That much was clear. But the question was, why? And what would happen when I finally uncovered the truth? The next morning, Nate was already gone by the time I woke up. His bed was neatly made, his bag missing from the corner of the room. I checked my watch. It wasn't even 7 yet. A quick glance out the window showed no sign of him, only the motel's faded neon sign blinking in the early light. I dressed quickly, feeling an odd mixture of irritation and worry. Perhaps he'd gone to check on the car, but a small voice in my head whispered doubts. After all, he hadn't mentioned any plans. He hadn't mentioned anything, really. I found Edgar in the dining area, leisurely pouring himself a cup of coffee, as if he had all the time in the world. He looked up as I entered, his eyes glinting with the same unsettling warmth he'd shown last night. "Morning, Mrs. Whitaker," he greeted, his voice too familiar for my liking. "Have you seen Nate?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, he was up bright and early," Edgar said, sipping his coffee. "Said he had some business to take care of in town." "Business," I repeated, confused. "What kind of business?" Edgar shrugged, but his eyes sparkled with an all-too-knowing look. "You'd have to ask him, though I wouldn't be surprised if it had something to do with why he came back here." The implication made me pause. "Back here? You mean he's been here before?" Edgar smiled, a thin, unsettling line on his face. "Yes, though I don't suppose he told you that?" I felt my heart beat a little faster. "No, he didn't mention it." "Well, some things are better left unsaid, I suppose," Edgar murmured, his gaze drifting out the window. "But you know how it is with family secrets. They always find a way to the surface." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. I was about to press him for more when Nate walked in, a gust of cool, morning air following him. His eyes darted between Edgar and me, a flash of something close to alarm crossing his face. "Morning," he muttered, looking pointedly at Edgar. "I see you're up early." Edgar raised his cup in a mock toast. "Just keeping your stepmother company." Nate's jaw tightened. "I think she's fine on her own." Without another word, Nate turned to me. "I went to check on the car," he said, as if it explained everything. "They're waiting on a part, so we'll be here at least another day." Something in his tone told me not to press further, so I nodded, swallowing the questions bubbling up inside me. But the tension between him and Edgar was impossible to ignore. I could see it in the way Nate avoided looking at him, the barely concealed irritation in his tone. Later that day, I decided to take a walk into the small town nearby, hoping a bit of fresh air would clear my mind. The town itself was a quiet, almost ghostly place, with only a handful of stores lining the main street. I stopped in at a cafe and ordered a coffee, settling by the window to watch the world go by. A few minutes later, a woman sat down at the table next to mine. She looked to be in her 60s, with sharp eyes that held a surprising amount of curiosity. "You're new in town," she said, her voice friendly yet cautious. I nodded. "Just passing through. My stepson and I got stranded here when our car broke down." Her eyes flicked toward the window where the motel's sign was just visible down the road. "Staying at the Elmwood, I see." "Yes," I replied, feeling a slight unease in her tone. "Do you know the place?" "Everyone in town knows the Elmwood," she said with a slight smile. "It's been here forever. And Edgar, well, he's practically part of the scenery." She paused, studying me carefully. "You say you're here with your stepson?" "Yes, Nate," I replied. "He's in town for a bit of family business." At the mention of Nate, her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. She nodded, her gaze turning back to her coffee. Must be nice having family to lean on. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, I sipped my coffee, glancing out the window. But the woman's words lingered in my mind. There was something in her tone, something that hinted at knowledge she wasn't sharing. When I returned to the inn, I found Nate pacing in our room, his expression a mixture of frustration and anxiety. He looked up as I entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone sharper than I'd expected. "I went for a walk into town," I replied, taken aback by his reaction. "Why?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "No reason. Just, I didn't see you when I got back." "Are you all right?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "You've been on edge ever since we arrived." He hesitated, glancing toward the window. "I just don't like being here, that's all." Before I could ask him to elaborate, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Edgar standing there, his face as unreadable as ever. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his tone polite but insistent. "But I thought you'd want to know, the mechanic just called. Your car should be ready by tomorrow afternoon." I felt a wave of relief, but Nate's expression remained tense. Edgar lingered in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Nate in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Well," he said finally, "I'll leave you to it. Just thought you'd want an update." After he left, Nate let out a long breath, as if he'd been holding it in the entire time. "Nate," I said quietly, "is there something going on between you and Edgar?" He looked at me, his jaw set. "It's complicated." "I'd like to understand," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "You've been acting strange ever since we got here, and Edgar seems to know you better than I do." For a moment, he looked as if he might tell me something, his eyes softening. But then he shook his head, as if dismissing the thought. "Just let it go, Lily," he said, his tone final. "It's not something you need to worry about." I wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, but something in his voice stopped me. This wasn't the time. Not yet. That night, I lay awake, the events of the past few days swirling in my mind. Edgar's strange familiarity with Nate. The way the townspeople seemed to know him. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. Around midnight, I heard Nate get out of bed. I watched as he slipped on his shoes and left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Curiosity gnawed at me, and after a moment's hesitation, I followed him, keeping my distance as he made his way down the dimly lit hallway. He exited through a side door, and I watched as he walked toward the edge of the property, where Edgar was waiting. They spoke in low voices, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby streetlight. I crept closer, straining to hear their conversation. "You're making a mistake," Edgar was saying, his tone cold and angry. "This isn't going to end the way you think." Nate's voice was equally tense. "I don't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice, Nate," Edgar replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "Don't act like a martyr. We both know what you're really after." Nate clenched his fists, his voice barely a whisper. "Just stay out of it, Edgar. This is between me and her." I froze, a chill running down my spine. Who was he talking about? Who was her? Before I could process what I'd heard, Edgar looked up, his gaze cutting through the darkness and landing directly on me. His lips curled into a twisted smile. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Seems we have company." Nate turned, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. "Lily, what are you doing here?" I stumbled back, feeling my face flush. I couldn't sleep. I heard voices." Edgar chuckled, a low, dark sound that seemed to echo through the night. "Curiosity can be a dangerous thing, Mrs. Whitaker. Haven't you heard that saying?" Nate's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of frustration in his eyes. "Let's go back inside," he said, reaching for my arm. As he led me back to our room, I felt a sense of dread settling over me. There was so much I didn't understand, so many pieces of the story I was missing. And Nate's refusal to open up only made it worse. When we got back to our room, he closed the door quietly, his face drawn and tense. I didn't want you to find out this way. He muttered, mostly to himself. Find out what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, a mixture of guilt and sadness in his eyes. It's not something I can explain. Not here, not now. I wanted to press him to demand answers, but something told me that he couldn't tell me the truth. Not yet. And as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was caught in something far bigger and far darker than I'd ever imagined. After that night, something shifted between Nate and me. He became withdrawn, his gaze distant, and there was a new tension in his voice, as though he was constantly guarding himself. Even the way he walked seemed different, shoulders hunched and wary, as if every step took him closer to something he dreaded. We had only a few more hours until the car was supposed to be ready, and the thought of leaving Elmwood Inn felt like an escape. I clung to that hope. But the feeling of escape was short-lived. As we waited in the lobby for word from the mechanic, Edgar strolled over, his eyes gleaming with that all-too-familiar mockery. Planning to head out so soon? He asked, a smile lurking beneath his words. Yes, Nate said firmly, a sharp edge to his voice. We're done here. Edgar chuckled. You think leaving changes anything? Some things follow you, no matter how far you run. Nate stiffened, his fists clenched, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something that looked like fear. I wanted to interject, to diffuse the tension, but something held me back. I sensed there was more to this than I could grasp, and my instinct told me to stay silent and listen. It's only a matter of time, Nate, Edgar continued, his voice soft but loaded with menace. You can't hide forever. Nate looked like he was about to respond, but instead, he turned away, muttering under his breath. He motioned for me to follow him outside. Once we were clear of Edgar's presence, he let out a shaky breath, his expression tight with anger. What was that all about? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. He hesitated, looking away, his jaw clenched. It's nothing, just an old grudge he won't let go. An old grudge? I echoed, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Nate, you can't keep shutting me out. You're acting like there's something terrible hanging over you. And Edgar, he talks like he knows you in ways I don't understand. Nate sighed, his shoulders sagging. It's complicated, Lily. There are things I did, things I'm not proud of. I came here to put it behind me, but Edgar won't let it go. I wanted to press him, to demand the truth, but the pain in his eyes stopped me. This was clearly something he carried deeply, something he'd buried for reasons I might never understand. As much as I wanted answers, I knew that pushing him now would only drive him further away. Let's just focus on getting out of here, he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. Once we leave, none of this will matter. I nodded, trying to push aside my own doubts and fears. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't be as simple as he thought. An hour later, we were back in the lobby, waiting for the mechanic's call when Edgar appeared again, his expression grave. Car's ready, he said, tossing a set of keys onto the counter. You can pick it up down the road. Nate grabbed the keys, muttering a curt thanks as he headed toward the door. I followed him, eager to be gone from the inn and the strange, suffocating tension that seemed to fill every corner of the place. We reached the mechanic's shop, but when we walked in, there was no sign of the car. Instead, the mechanic, a heavy-set man with a grizzled beard, looked up from under the hood of another vehicle, wiping his hands on a rag. Looking for your car? He asked, his voice thick with a local drawl. Yes, Nate replied, frowning. We were told it was ready. The mechanic's brow furrowed. It should have been, but Edgar called earlier, said you wouldn't be needing it right away. So I didn't finish up. Nate's face paled, and his hands clenched into fists. He did what? The mechanic shrugged, clearly oblivious to the tension in Nate's voice. Said there'd been a change of plans. Thought you were sticking around for a bit. My stomach twisted. The idea of staying another night in that inn felt like a trap, like a web tightening around us. I could see the frustration boiling in Nate's expression, the barely contained anger that seemed to simmer beneath his surface. But there was nothing we could do. Edgar's interference had sealed our fate, at least for one more night. Back at the inn, the atmosphere was colder than before. Edgar greeted us with his usual smirk, but there was an unmistakable glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Looks like you're staying with us a bit longer," he said, his tone too cheerful for comfort. Nate ignored him, storming past to our room. I followed, feeling a growing unease settle in my chest. The moment we were inside, Nate slammed the door shut, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "That man. He's going to ruin everything." "What did he mean about following you?" I asked, my voice low. Nate hesitated, his expression flickering with something dark and conflicted. "Edgar and we were friends once back when I used to live here. Things went south, and let's just say he's never forgiven me." "Why?" I pressed, sensing that the answer would shed light on everything that had happened. He ran a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping. "There was someone I cared about, a woman. Edgar was involved with her too. It got complicated. Things happened that shouldn't have. And now he's set on making me pay for it." His confession felt like a revelation, and yet I sensed there was more he wasn't saying. The tension in his voice hinted at wounds much deeper than he'd admitted, at secrets that he'd buried beneath layers of guilt and regret. "So what happens now?" I asked softly. He looked away, his voice barely audible. "I don't know. I just know that as long as we're here, Edgar's not going to let me forget." That evening, I went down to the dining area to get a glass of water. The inn was nearly empty, save for a few guests scattered around. But Edgar was there, his eyes fixed on me the moment I entered. He approached, a slow, deliberate stride that felt almost predatory. "Mrs. Whitaker," he greeted, his voice smooth. "I hope Nate hasn't been too much trouble." I narrowed my eyes, unwilling to play his game. "Whatever's going on between you two, it's none of my business." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," he replied, his smile widening. "You're more involved than you think." His words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to turn and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot, as though his gaze held me captive. "You think you know him," Edgar continued, his voice low and mocking. "But Nate has secrets, things he'll never tell you, things that would make you question everything." I clenched my jaw, unwilling to let him get under my skin. "I don't need your warnings, Edgar. Whatever issues you have with Nate, leave me out of it." Edgar laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Believe me, Mrs. Whitaker, I'm only looking out for you. There's a reason he doesn't want you to know the truth." I forced myself to walk away, his words echoing in my mind. But as I returned to the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that Edgar was right. Nate's behavior, his secrecy, it all pointed to something he was hiding, something he didn't want me to uncover. That night, I lay awake again, the weight of unasked questions pressing down on me. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and shifting in the darkness. I felt trapped, not only in this place, but in the mystery that had drawn me in, a mystery that felt as if it would consume me whole. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the door. The handwriting was scrawled, hurried, but the message was clear. "Meet me in the woods behind the inn. 10 a.m. There was no signature, but I knew who it was from. I slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake Nate. I dressed quickly, my heart pounding as I slipped out of the room and made my way to the back of the property. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. I found Edgar waiting for me, his expression unreadable. "You're brave to come alone," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Just tell me what you want," I replied, refusing to let him intimidate me. He studied me for a moment, his gaze piercing. "I want you to understand the man you're defending, Nate isn't who you think he is. Then tell me, I challenged, crossing my arms. Tell me what he's done. He hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. Nate was involved in something dark, something that hurt people. He thinks he can run from it, but he's wrong. It's only a matter of time before it catches up to him. What exactly are you accusing him of? I demanded, feeling a surge of anger. Edgar's smile was cold. Ask him yourself. But don't be surprised if he lies. That's what he does best. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the clearing, his words hanging in the air like a curse. When I returned to the room, Nate was awake, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Where were you? He asked, his voice tight. I went for a walk, I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. I needed some air. He studied me, his gaze searching. Lily, I know things haven't been easy. I know I've been keeping things from you, but I need you to trust me. Whatever Edgar says, he's only trying to turn you against me. His words felt sincere, but Edgar's warnings echoed in my mind. I wanted to believe Nate, to trust that he was telling the truth. But the shadows lurking in his eyes told a different story. A story he wasn't ready to share. I just want to understand, I whispered. I want to help you, Nate, but I can't do that if you keep shutting me out. He looked down, his hands clenched at his sides. Maybe when we get back. Maybe then I can tell you everything. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the only one he was willing to give. And as we prepared to leave Elmwood Inn, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, whatever it was, would haunt us long after we'd left. We left the Elmwood Inn the next morning, both of us tense and silent as we loaded our things into the car. Nate barely looked at me, his face tight with whatever thoughts plagued him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had taken place, that we were leaving with far more questions than we'd arrived with. Edgar's words echoed in my mind as I climbed into the passenger seat. He had made it clear that he wanted me to doubt Nate, to see him through his own warped lens. And yet, I couldn't ignore the hints he'd dropped, the ominous accusations that had left a chill in my heart. As we pulled onto the highway, I glanced at Nate, searching for any sign of reassurance. But he seemed lost in his own world, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The drive was long, and the silence between us felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. I thought of all the things I wanted to say, the questions I wanted to ask, but every time I opened my mouth, something held me back. A feeling that once I crossed that line, there would be no going back. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Nate, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Back there, Edgar said things about your past. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He said you were hiding something, that you'd hurt people. I continued, my voice trembling. I need to know if any of it is true. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he let out a long, shuddering breath, his hands loosening on the wheel. Edgar, he began, his voice thick with anger and regret. He never lets anything go, not even after all these years. I waited, my heart pounding. There was someone, he admitted, his voice barely audible. A woman I was involved with before I met you and Hal. It was complicated. She was involved with Edgar too. Things got messy. He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. We both thought we loved her, but it was more of an obsession. She played us against each other, and we let her. Things spiraled, and one night it all came crashing down. We fought, Edgar and I, and after that, she was gone. Gone, I echoed, my voice shaky. What do you mean? What do you mean? Nate's face paled, and for the first time I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. She disappeared, Lily. No one knows what blames me, says I drove her away. But I swear, I had nothing to do with it. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. A woman had vanished, and Nate was at the center of it. I wanted to believe him, to trust that he was telling the truth. But the doubt lingered, creeping into my mind like a shadow. As the days passed, I tried to put the events at Elmwood behind me. But the memory of Edgar's warnings and Nate's confession gnawed at me, an itch I couldn't scratch. I began to notice things, small, subtle changes in Nate's behavior. Moments where his smile didn't reach his eyes, where his laughter felt hollow. One evening, as we were sorting through some of Hal's belongings, I came across a box labeled Nate. Inside were photographs, letters, mementos from his younger years. There was a picture of him with a woman, her face obscured by a shadow, but I could see her hand resting on his shoulder, her fingers lightly entwined with his. My heart clenched as I stared at the photograph. Was this the woman he'd spoken of? The one who had come between him and Edgar? And what had really happened to her? I couldn't stop myself from looking through the rest of the box, hoping for some clue, some explanation. But all I found were fragments of a life I barely recognized, pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. Later that night, I confronted Nate again, unable to keep my silence any longer. "Nate," I began, my voice strained. "I found a photo today, a picture of you with a woman. Is that her?" He looked up, his face a mask of guilt and regret. "Yes," he admitted, his voice hollow. "That's her." I felt a surge of anger, of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell Hal?" He shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I was ashamed, Lily. I thought I could bury it, move on. But Edgar, he's always there, reminding me of what happened, of what he thinks I did." "What did happen, Nate?" I pressed, feeling the weight of his silence. He hesitated, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know. One night she just left. No goodbye, no explanation. Edgar blames me, says I pushed her away. But I swear I didn't do anything to her. She just vanished." His words hung in the air, heavy with unresolved tension. I wanted to believe him, to trust that he was telling the truth. But the doubt lingered, like a shadow lurking in the corner of my mind. The days turned into weeks, and our lives slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the memory of Elmwood Inn, of Edgar's accusations and Nate's confession, refused to fade. I found myself watching Nate, searching for signs that would confirm or deny my suspicions. But he remained as distant as ever, locked in a world of his own. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and my heart froze. It was Edgar. He stood on the porch, a grim smile on his face, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Hello, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I thought it was time we had a little chat." I felt a surge of anger, of fear. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see Nate," he replied, his gaze flickering toward the living room. "There are some things we need to discuss." Before I could respond, Nate appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He stared at Edgar, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "Get out," he growled, his voice barely more than a whisper. Edgar chuckled, stepping into the house despite Nate's warning. "Now, is that any way to treat an old friend?" Nate moved forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "I told you, Edgar, I want nothing to do with you." Edgar smirked, his gaze shifting to me. "Does she know, Nate? Does she know what really happened?" Nate's face twisted with rage, and he lunged at Edgar, his fist swinging. They grappled, their bodies colliding in a blur of fury and resentment. I tried to pull them apart, but they were locked in a battle I couldn't stop, a struggle fueled by years of betrayal and bitterness. Finally, they broke apart, both of them panting, their faces flushed with anger. "You can't run from this, Nate," Edgar spat, his voice filled with venom. "You may have convinced yourself that you're innocent, but I know the truth. And so does she." He turned to me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Ask him, Mrs. Whitaker, ask him about that night. See if he'll tell you what really happened." With that, he stormed out of the house, leaving us in a silence that felt as heavy as a tomb. I turned to Nate, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions. "Nate," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What did he mean? What happened that night?" He looked away, his face pale and haunted. I can't. I can't talk about it." I felt a surge of frustration, of despair. Why? Why won't you tell me the truth? Because, he replied, his voice barely a whisper, because I don't even know the truth myself. The days that followed were a blur of silence and suspicion. Nate retreated further into himself, his face drawn and haunted, as if he were wrestling with a darkness he couldn't escape. I tried to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but he pushed me away, his gaze cold and distant. And then, one night, he was gone. I woke to find his side of the bed empty, the house eerily silent. I searched every room, every corner, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he'd vanished, leaving nothing behind but the lingering scent of his cologne. Desperate, I called Edgar, hoping he might have some answers. But his phone went straight to voicemail, his voice a mocking echo in the silence. For days, I searched for Nate, combing through the town, questioning everyone I could. But no one had seen him, and every lead turned into a dead end. It was as if he'd been swallowed by the shadows, leaving me alone with nothing but questions and regrets. Months passed, and life moved on, but the memory of Nate haunted me like a ghost. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there somewhere, hiding from a past he couldn't escape. And though I tried to move on, to let go of the memories, the questions lingered, gnawing at my mind like a festering wound. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear a sound, a soft knock at the door, a whisper in the darkness, and I'd wonder if it was him, if he'd come back to finish what he'd started. But each time the silence would settle, leaving me alone with the haunting echo of a story that had no end. It was just a light brush of my foot against his leg beneath the dining table. An accident, nothing more. Or at least, that's what I told myself at first. But when I felt him press back, the warmth of his knee lingering against mine, everything in me froze. He didn't pull away. I didn't either. And in that fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between us. Something that I knew, deep down, I'd never be able to ignore. I shouldn't have let it happen. I know that now. But in the moment, as I sat there with my stepson across from me, my husband obliviously scrolling through emails on his phone, I couldn't bring myself to break the connection. It was as if the rest of the world had gone silent, leaving just the two of us caught in a charged silence that neither of us dared to acknowledge. The dinner table had always been a stage for awkwardness in our household. My husband, Dale, was a man of few words, more likely to bring his work to the table than a meaningful conversation. Grant, his son from his first marriage, had moved back in a month ago after finishing college, bringing with him a quiet confidence that made his presence impossible to ignore. I remember glancing at Dale that night, hoping for a distraction, but he was too busy with whatever crisis his company was facing this time. I returned my gaze to Grant, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't before. A glint of curiosity, maybe even daring. It was unsettling. It was thrilling. The days leading up to that moment had been innocuous enough, or so I thought. I was adjusting to having Grant around the house again, falling into the polite but distant dynamic that had defined our relationship since I married Dale 2 years ago. At first, I thought his return wouldn't disrupt my life too much. He was charming and respectful, but our interactions rarely went beyond the surface. But over the past few weeks, things had started to change. It wasn't just me noticing him, it was him noticing me. The way his gaze lingered a second longer when I walked into the room. The way he'd find excuses to stay in the kitchen when I was cooking, offering to help with small tasks that didn't need doing. And now, this. When the dinner ended and the dishes were cleared, I retreated to the kitchen under the guise of cleaning up, desperate for a moment to collect myself. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling as I scrubbed at a plate that didn't need scrubbing. I didn't hear him come in until he spoke. "Need a hand?" His voice was calm, casual, but when I looked at him, there was something in his expression that made my pulse quicken. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, turning back to the sink. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me in that quiet, steady way of his. "You've been quiet tonight," he said after a moment. I forced a laugh. Just tired, I guess. Sure, he replied, his tone unreadable. I couldn't look at him. I was afraid of what I'd see, or worse, what he'd see in me. But even as I tried to focus on the dishes, I couldn't ignore the way my body hummed with the memory of that fleeting touch under the table. Good night, Grant, I said finally, my voice firmer than I felt. Good night, Catherine, he replied, his voice soft, almost knowing. I heard him leave, his footsteps fading down the hall, and I let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the sink as if it could steady me. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment, just a mistake. But deep down, I knew better. After that night, things between Grant and me shifted. Subtly at first, like the faintest crack in a sheet of ice. Imperceptible unless you were paying attention. But I was paying attention, more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just me, though. I could feel it in him, too. The way he lingered a second too long when we crossed paths in the hallway, his casual questions about my day, his effortless smile, that now seemed to carry a hint of something more. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overthinking harmless interactions. But the problem wasn't him. It was me. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen slicing lemons for a pitcher of iced tea when Grant wandered in, barefoot and shirtless, a towel draped over his shoulders. His skin glistened with sweat from what I assumed was a run, and I forced myself to focus on the knife in my hand. Hot out there, he said, reaching for a glass. Looks like it, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. As he filled the glass with water, I couldn't help but glance up, just for a moment. But he caught me. His eyes met mine over the rim of the glass, and for the first time there was no pretense between us. No polite stepmother-stepson dynamic to hide behind. Something on your mind, he asked, his voice low, teasing, but not unkind. I shook my head quickly, turning back to the cutting board. Just making tea? I said, my voice too bright, too forced. He didn't push further, but as he walked past me to leave the kitchen, his hand brushed lightly against the small of my back. It was such a fleeting touch, so innocent on the surface, but it left me rooted in place, the knife trembling in my hand. That evening, Dale was home but locked in his office as usual, barking orders on a conference call. I was curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in hand and a novel open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single word. Grant walked in, freshly showered, his hair damp and tousled. Mind if I join you? He asked, gesturing to the opposite end of the couch. Of course, I said, pretending to be engrossed in my book. He sat down, closer than I'd expected, the cushions dipping under his weight. For a while we sat in silence, the faint murmur of the TV filling the room. I was hyper-aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne. You seem different lately, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I glanced up, startled. Different how? He shrugged, his gaze steady, quieter, distracted. I laughed nervously, taking a sip of wine. Just adjusting, I guess. It's been a while since the house wasn't so empty. Does it bother you? He asked, leaning back against the couch. What? Having me here, he said, his tone casual, but there was an edge to it. I mean, I know I kind of dropped back into your life out of nowhere. Of course not, I said quickly. It's nice, actually. The house feels alive again. He smiled at that, but it wasn't the boyish, carefree smile I'd seen before. It was softer, almost intimate. Good, he said. I looked away, my heart pounding. I should head to bed, I said, standing too quickly and nearly spilling my wine. Grant stood too, reaching out to steady me. His hand brushed mine, and the contact lingered for a second too long. Good night, Catherine, he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Good night, I replied, barely able to meet his gaze. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and awkward silences. I tried to avoid him, to focus on my work, but it was impossible in a house so small. And yet, I found myself drawn to him, like a moth to a flame. One afternoon, I was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes that Dale always neglected. The sun was hot on my back, and I'd just set down the shears when I heard footsteps behind me. Need some help? Grant asked, his voice startling me. I turned to find him standing there, shirtless again, a light sheen of sweat on his skin. I think I've got it, I said, though my voice wavered. He crouched beside me, plucking a stray weed from the soil. You shouldn't be doing all this yourself, he said. What's Dad even doing half the time? I smiled faintly. Working, always working. He looked up at me, his gaze searching. Does that bother you? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. It's just how he is, I said finally. That's not what I asked, he said, his voice gentle but insistent. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could say anything, he reached out, his hand lightly brushing mine where it rested on the ground. Grant, I said, my voice barely audible. He didn't move, didn't pull away. You don't have to say anything, he said. I need you to know that I see you. I see how hard you try to hold everything together, how much you give, and how little you get back. You deserve more than that. His words hit me like a blow, the truth of them sinking deep into my chest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. And then, as if by some invisible force, I leaned in. It wasn't much, just a slight shift, a small step closer, but it was enough. His hand slid over mine, his touch warm and steady, and I knew in that moment that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. I can't, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Yes, you can, he replied, his voice low and certain. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the world around us fading into nothing. And then finally, I pulled away, my heart racing. I have to go, I said, my voice trembling. I didn't look back as I hurried inside, but I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on me like a storm cloud. And deep down, I knew this was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grant. His face, the way his hand had lingered on mine, the way his voice had softened when he said, I deserved more. The logical part of me screamed that this had to stop, that I was on the verge of making a catastrophic mistake. But there was another part of me, a darker, quieter part, that didn't want to stop. The next day, I avoided him entirely. I left the house early, claiming errands I didn't need to run, and didn't return until well after dark. By the time I got home, the lights in Grant's room were off, and the house was silent. I let myself breathe, telling myself that the space between us would let things settle. But it didn't. 3 days later, I found him in the library. It was late. Dale was out of town on a business trip, and the house felt empty without him. I'd gone to pour myself a glass of wine, but as I passed the library, I saw the light was on. Grant was sitting in one of the leather armchairs, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a book open on his lap. He looked up when I stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Couldn't sleep, I asked, hesitating in the doorway. Something like that, he replied. What about you? I held up my glass. Nightcap? He gestured to the chair across from him. Join me? I should have said no. Instead, I sat down, clutching the wine glass like a shield. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I've been thinking about what you said, I said finally, my voice breaking the stillness. He looked at me, his brow furrowing. What I said? In the garden, I clarified, my gaze fixed on the floor. About seeing me, about deserving more. His expression softened. I meant it, he said. You shouldn't have said it, I whispered. Why not? He asked, his voice gentle but firm. Because it's not your place, I said, finally looking up at him. I'm your stepmother, Grant. Whatever this is, it can't happen. He leaned forward, setting his glass down on the table between us. I don't see you as my stepmother, Catherine, he said quietly. I never have. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, but no words came. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Our relationship had never felt familial, not in the way it should have. Tell me you don't feel it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me I'm imagining this. I couldn't. Instead, I stood abruptly, my glass nearly slipping from my hand. I need to go, I said, my voice shaking. But as I turned to leave, he caught my wrist. His touch was firm but not forceful, and when I looked back at him, his eyes were filled with something raw and unguarded. Don't run from this, he said. I'm not running, I lied, though my heart was pounding in my chest. Yes, you are, he said softly. You've been running since the moment this started. I stared at him, torn between every instinct screaming at me to leave and the magnetic pull that kept me rooted in place. And then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The first kiss was hesitant, almost timid, as if we were both afraid of what it meant, but it quickly deepened, the weight of our suppressed emotions breaking free all at once. When we finally pulled apart, I was trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. This is wrong, I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. Then why does it feel so right? He asked, his gaze locked on mine. I woke the next morning with a heavy weight in my chest. The memory of what had happened in the library was vivid and undeniable, and for a brief, blissful moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. But when I stepped into the kitchen, there he was, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up as I entered, and the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said casually, as if nothing had changed. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely audible. For a moment we stood there in silence, the unspoken tension between us almost suffocating. Finally he set his cup down and crossed the room, stopping just a foot away from me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "We shouldn't have done that," I said, my words barely above a whisper. "Maybe not," he said, his gaze steady. "But I'm not sorry?" I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "This can't happen again, Grant." He didn't respond immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I think we both know that's not true." His words sent a shiver through me, and I knew, deep down, that he was right. Over the next week, we tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the facade quickly crumbled. The stolen moments became impossible to resist. A brush of his hand against mine as we passed in the hallway, a whispered exchange in the kitchen when Dale was in his office. One evening, while Dale was out at a late meeting, Grant and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The tension between us was unbearable, and when he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, I didn't pull away. The secrecy of it all only heightened the intensity. We met in hidden corners of the house, in the garden after dark, and even in the guest house at the edge of the property. Every stolen moment felt like a victory against the inevitability of discovery. But the weight of what we were doing grew heavier with each passing day. The fragile bubble we'd built was shattered when Dale announced that Annalise, an old family friend, would be staying with us for a few days. Annalise was sharp, perceptive, and always seemed to know more than she let on. From the moment she arrived, I could feel her eyes on me, watching, analyzing. She was too clever for her own good, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she pieced things together. And then there was the night she cornered me in the kitchen, her expression unreadable. "You seem different, Catherine," she said, her tone light but her words heavy with implication. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I wonder if Dale knows." My blood ran cold. "Knows what?" Her smile was slow, calculated. "You tell me." The days after Annalise's cryptic comment were excruciating. I couldn't tell if she genuinely suspected something or if she was simply toying with me, but her presence in the house made every moment feel like walking a tightrope. She hovered during meals, peppering Grant and me with innocent-sounding questions that felt loaded with meaning. I tried to act normal, but the strain of hiding what was happening between Grant and me was taking its toll. The stolen moments that once felt thrilling now carried the weight of paranoia, and I started to wonder how long we could keep this up before everything came crashing down. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen, expecting a text from Dale or one of my friends, but the message made my blood turn cold. "I know what you're doing." There was no name, no number, just a blank sender. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It had to be a mistake. But then another message came through. "Meet me tomorrow at 4 p.m., the coffee shop on Main Street. Don't make me come to Dale." I locked the phone and pressed it against my chest, struggling to breathe. Who could it be? Annalise? No, she was far too smug to hide behind anonymous threats. Someone else had seen something, someone who now held my entire life in their hands. The next morning, I found Grant in the guest house where he'd been spending most of his time since Annalise's arrival. He was seated at the small desk, flipping through a stack of papers, but he looked up the moment I entered. "Hey," he said, his tone warm, but his smile faded as soon as he saw my face. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, closing the door behind me. "We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" I handed him my phone, showing him the messages. He read them quickly, his jaw tightening. "Who the hell sent this?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But whoever it is, they know. They're threatening to tell Dale. Grant stood, pacing the small space as he processed the situation. It could be Annalise, he said finally. She's been watching us like a hawk. I thought that too, but this doesn't feel like her, I said. She's the type to confront me directly, not hide behind anonymous messages. Then who? I don't know, I said again, my voice breaking. Grant stepped closer, placing his hands on my shoulders. Hey, he said softly, we'll figure this out. I won't let anything happen to you, Catherine. His words were reassuring, but they did little to quell the fear bubbling inside me. At 4 p.m. sharp, I walked into the small coffee shop on Main Street. It was a quiet place, with only a handful of customers scattered across the tables. I scanned the room, looking for someone, anyone, who might be the sender of the messages. I didn't have to wait long. A man in his late 50s stood from a table in the corner, waving me over. I froze, recognizing him immediately. Richard, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard Hadley was Dale's former business partner. The two of them had founded their company together over 20 years ago, but their partnership had ended in a bitter falling out. Dale had always spoken of Richard with disdain, calling him a liar and a thief. What do you want? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended as I slid into the seat across from him. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's good to see you too, Catherine, he said smoothly. Cut the pleasantries, I snapped. You sent the messages, didn't you? Guilty, he admitted, leaning back in his chair. What do you want? I repeated. Richard's smile widened. I want your help, he said simply. Help with what? With ruining Dale, he replied, his tone casual, as if he were asking me to pass the sugar. I stared at him, stunned. You're out of your mind. Maybe, he said, shrugging, but that doesn't change the fact that I have something you don't want getting out. You don't have any proof, I said, though my voice wavered with uncertainty. Don't I? He countered, pulling his phone from his pocket. He tapped the screen a few times before sliding it across the table. My stomach dropped as I saw the image, a blurry but unmistakable photo of Grant and me in the garden, his hand brushing my cheek as we leaned toward each other. How did you? I trailed off, my voice failing me. I have my ways, he said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Now here's the deal. You helped me sabotage Dale's latest deal with Roswell Ventures, and this picture never sees the light of day. Refuse, and I think we both know where this ends. I returned home that evening, feeling like a trapped animal. I couldn't tell Dale, not without destroying everything, and I couldn't give in to Richard's demands without betraying my husband in an entirely new way. When I told Grant what had happened, he was furious. We can't let him get away with this, he said, pacing the guest house like a caged lion. What choice do we have? I asked, my voice breaking. He stopped, turning to me with a look of determination. I'll take the fall, he said. No, I said immediately. I won't let you do that. What other option is there? He demanded. If this gets out, it'll destroy your life, Catherine. And what about you? I countered. You think this won't ruin you too? He didn't have an answer, but the tension in the room was palpable. That night, Annalise cornered me again, this time in the hallway outside my bedroom. You look stressed, she said, her voice laced with false concern. It's been a long day, I replied, trying to brush past her. She stepped in front of me, blocking my path. You know, Catherine, she said, her tone dropping, secrets have a way of coming out, no matter how well you think you're hiding them. I stared at her, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? She smiled, a predator's smile. You tell me. For the first time, I realized she might be bluffing, but whether she knew the truth or not, one thing was clear. My carefully constructed world was on the verge of collapse. The breaking point came during one of Dale's lavish dinner parties. His obsession with appearances was on full display. A perfectly manicured lawn, an endless stream of champagne, and a carefully curated guest list of business associates and friends. Annalise, of course, was there, gliding through the room like a predator waiting to pounce. Grant and I avoided each other all night, barely exchanging a glance. But the tension between us was like a live wire. Richard, however, was conspicuously absent, which unsettled me even more. I had no idea if he was planning to expose me tonight or if he was merely letting me stew in my own anxiety. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was about to crumble. Dinner was served outside, the long table glittering with candles and crystal glasses. I sat beside Dale, who was regaling the guests with a story about his latest business deal, while Grant was seated 2 spots down, his expression unreadable. I tried to focus on my plate, but my appetite had vanished. Halfway through the meal, Annalise leaned forward, her voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. "Dale, you're lucky to have Catherine. She's been holding everything together while you're off saving the world." Dale chuckled, clearly missing the venom laced in her words. "That's what makes her perfect," he said, raising his glass. Annalise's smile widened, but her gaze shifted to me. "She's certainly been busy," she said, her voice deceptively light. My chest tightened, and I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the tablecloth. Grant's fork clinked against his plate as he set it down, his jaw tightening. "Is there a point to this, Annalise?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Oh, no point," she replied innocently, "just making conversation." But the smirk she shot me told me she knew exactly what she was doing. After dinner, I excused myself to the kitchen, desperate for a moment to breathe. My hands were shaking as I gripped the counter, trying to steady myself. But before I could calm down, Dale walked in, his expression dark. "Catherine," he said, his voice low and cold. I turned, my heart sinking. "What is it?" He held up his phone, and the sight of the screen made my stomach drop. It was the photo Richard had taken, the one of Grant and me in the garden. "Care to explain this?" Dale asked, his voice deceptively calm. I opened my mouth, but no words came. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but there was nothing I could say to undo what he'd seen. "Who sent this to you?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Richard," Dale said. "He emailed it to me this morning, along with a lot of other interesting accusations." I swallowed hard, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. "It's not what it looks like," I said weakly, though we both knew it was a lie. "What is it then?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife and my son have been sneaking around behind my back." Before I could respond, Grant appeared in the doorway. His eyes flicked between Dale and me, and he immediately understood what was happening. "This is my fault," he said, stepping forward. Dale turned on him, his face a mask of rage. "You're damn right it's your fault. You come back here into my house and this is how you repay me?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," Grant said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "But don't blame Catherine. This was all me." "Don't you dare try to protect her," Dale snapped. "She's just as guilty as you are." "Stop," I said, finally finding my voice. "This isn't helping." "Helping?" Dale laughed bitterly. "You think there's anything that can fix this?" Before the argument could escalate further, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw another message from Richard. "How's Dale taking the news?" The realization hit me like a freight train. Richard hadn't sent the photo to Dale out of some twisted sense of justice. This was all part of his plan to destroy him. "Dale, listen to me," I said, stepping closer. "Richard set this up. He's been blackmailing me for weeks, threatening to expose us unless I helped him sabotage your business deal with Roswell Ventures." Dale frowned, his anger momentarily giving way to confusion. "What are you talking about?" "He's using this," I said, holding up my phone, "to manipulate me. He wants to ruin you, and he's using us to do it." For a moment, Dale said nothing, his gaze flicking between me and Grant. Finally he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't deal with this right now," he muttered, turning and walking out of the room. Grant and I were left standing in the kitchen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. "This is over," I said finally, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression pained. "Catherine." "No," I said firmly, "it's done. We've caused enough damage." He didn't argue, but the look in his eyes said everything he couldn't. Dale filed for divorce the next day. He didn't say much, but his cold demeanor made it clear that he wanted nothing more to do with me. Grant moved out shortly after, leaving without so much as a goodbye. As for Richard, his plan to sabotage Dale's deal backfired when Dale reported him to the authorities for blackmail. The last I heard, he was under investigation for fraud.